I have already mentioned Hercules columns in several videos here. Over time, new clues are emerging that indicate what the entire earthly structure looked like. Specifically, the anchoring of the stone grates to the columns. The entire Earth grid and its plates were suspended over a single vast ocean, which Plato calls the true sea. Isn't that possible? Yes. Our material understanding of this world and a single scientific dogma has obscured the fact that the biblical flood of the world and the flood of Atlantis are very likely the one event that has become the subject of all philosophical and sacred books. So let's do a little recap to better understand this mystery. Most modern references to Atlantis are probably found in Italy, i.e. in the old Roman Empire and the former Greek provinces in southern Italy. Very interesting in this respect is Rome's Piazza del Popolo, People's Square, with its interesting columns. They are part of the fountain on Monte Pincio and have strange handles, as if they were holding something. In addition to these handles, we also see anchors. In ancient Roman ports, ships were probably tied to similar columns, as we see in the surviving fresco from the villa at Stabii. But these columns have no handles that resemble those on the fountain columns. Similar columns were certainly also part of the harbour at Herculaneum, which disappeared after the eruption in 79. When Plato spoke of Atlantis, he wrote of the columns, which we call Hercules columns. He was referring to the columns in the harbour where he probably stayed. Plato was a Greek and Herculaneum was then owned by Greek sailors. So what about the anchors on the columns? They look like they're holding something. Earth grids. Let's take another closer look at the details of the fountain. On the top of both columns are armor, shield, helmet and two griffin heads. Underneath there are 3 handles on each side and 3 anchors in the middle of the column. We see a deity in the middle and strange sea creatures at the bottom. The woman in the middle is also dressed as a warrior and takes a very similar stance to the Statue of Liberty. She is probably also carrying a light. Under her feet we see a Roman she-wolf, Romulus and Remus, and angels standing in the background. To illustrate, let's take a good look at this find in India's Gulf of Kutch. Here beautifully preserved slabs have been discovered lying on stone grates. Note the precise geometry. They must have been carved. You are all familiar with the petroglyphs on the Nazca Plain. The lines, whose purpose is unknown in scientific circles, are the lines from which the spider weaves the Earth's grid. And a hummingbird that isn't a hummingbird? There's an Indian legend about a big bird that sleeps saliva on a rock until the rock melted. What structure then held the whole lost world? It was based on gigantic columns on which stone grates were suspended. These grates carried slabs which Plato says had channels cut into them. Humans are tiny on Earth and cannot think in dimensions beyond their imagination. The legend of Semiramis's hanging gardens may be a simile for hanging grates in the sense of suspended, not extended. The gardens, because of the geometry of the land plates, created different patterns intersected by a network of water channels. Strips of land alternated with strips of water. Plato. Let's see Plato's words in practice. Rotunda, Florida. Where did she come from? Note that the geometry is incomplete, with one segment missing. The surrounding area is swampy. But if we highlight the lines where the blue color represents water, we get an incredible view. So let's take another look at what the actual columns looked like when they were pulled down by the tremendous force during the cataclysm. The vast majority of the satellite images were taken from an altitude of about 6–11 kilometers, 3.7 to 6.8 miles, and you can see their magnificence. They are buried in rock that shows signs of liquefaction. In other words, the rock has flowed over these objects. Rock that used to be water, because our whole world has been petrified. In a moment. Some of the columns appear to be colored and very probably were hollow. Some resemble gigantic organ pipes due to the holes from which the anchorage has been torn out, creating water reservoirs on the surface. We'll look at them later. By the way, the resemblance of the pipes to the columns will not be accidental. The architecture of religious buildings is inspired by the architecture of the Old World. Don't you believe it? And do you have a church in your neighborhood? Take a good look. Because even the church bell is related to the geometry of the earth. In the following image, taken from an altitude of 16 kilometers, almost 10 miles, the sinkholes are clearly visible at the site of the collapsed column. These are wells or watering holes connected by strange lines, traces of the anchoring of the Earth's grid. No vegetation grows on these lines, forming natural trails. The image was taken at an altitude of 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles, and shows the rock spilling over the columns. Some appear it will be badly damaged, since it takes a very high temperature to melt stone. The columns may be made of heat-resistant basalt. Basalt is also mentioned by the Bible. Many of these objects lie beneath Mexican fields. The scanner reveals a whole complex geometry. The wheels we see in the next image were very likely placed here after the fact. In some areas, they are used to grow crops because the groundwater rises here. Where groundwater is absent, deserts, impermeable rock, these formations are removed in some places. Beneath them, the geometry of a vanished world reappears. As for the circles themselves, They are probably made of permeable limestone. And you can learn about his journey with the giants from the Sumerian plate. The following is a special finding that I have already presented here. It is a gigantic column with a circular square in the middle. The circle has partially melted and collapsed. And we can see the devastation in the rock. The lines around it are traces of ancient anchoring. Elsewhere in New Mexico we find the same circle, but very devastated. But it appears that there was something else in the middle that resembles a sonar image from the Baltic Anomaly Survey. It's as if another circular grate has been submerged here. On the border of Bolivia, Chile and Argentina, a circular grid is revealed in the mountains. Unfortunately, a more recent image is not yet available. India is also rich in symbols from the Old World. Take a look at this photo from one of India's temples. We're looking at a pillar with a circular disc on top. Above the disc in the middle is another object. What does it mean? What's certain is that it looks very much like a buried column under Mexican territory. Same wheels without columns with square center. The following photos show watering tanks in New Mexico. They have a very strange geometry, many of them are very deformed. Some of these tanks are connected to the water table. Others dry up and fill up during the rainy season. They are usually surrounded by an open mound, the ends of which disappear below the surface. Here again we seem to have traces of the broken anchorage of the Earth's grid. Lake Patterson was formed by the sinking of calcareous sediments through stone grates, creating remarkable pools. Parts of the grids are still visible under the New Mexico Territory. Where groundwater seeps through, vegetation clings to these formations. But in some areas, the opposite is true. Vegetation avoids these lines. This concludes our first installment on the columns and anchoring of the Earth's ancient landmass. We'll look at a special place. Miners here have discovered the remains of a circular city buried beneath the rock. Today, the site doesn't look like a city. You'll find only petrified fragments and traces of urban roads. The city was buried by the rock, as you can see in the picture. In the next photo, local people have written a huge inscription on the rock. There is truth in the Bible. Read it.